This is Module 2 of the course Developing Asp.NET 3.5 Web Applications in C#. The title of this module is Web Applications with Visual Studio 2008. We're going to take a look at Visual Studio 2008 as a web development environment, and we'll see how to use it to create an Asp.NET web application. And then after that we'll see how to use it to create classes and components. Visual Studio 2008 has a number of features that we're going to take a look at, and also a variety of project templates that you can use to create starter files for various types of .NET projects. And then we'll take an overview look at Visual Studio 2008 Integrated Development Environment and become familiar with its user interface. So what are the features of Visual Studio? Well, it allows you to choose from multiple programming languages, and there's a large number available. The two most popular managed languages are C# and VB, but you can choose other alternatives such as managed C++. Visual Studio also provides you with a number of types of projects and solutions that you can work with, and as we'll see, we can create websites that are either project-oriented or folder-oriented. Also, the Visual Studio tool allows you to select from a list of .NET framework versions that you want your application to target. So that is the .NET 2.0, 3.0, and 3.5. You can actually choose which one you want to work with in any particular project. Visual Studio also provides a convenient Asp.NET development server. That is a web server that's ideal for development purposes, and it can also be used for testing and debugging purposes. Of course, when you actually deploy it, you will not use that server. You will use IIS, which is the web server that's used for hosting Asp.NET web applications. But Asp.NET Development Server is an excellent tool for doing quick testing of code. Also, Visual Studio has great support for debugging and tracing and profiling, and it has a customizable integrated development environment user interface. It can be used for creating web forms and WinForms based applications, and it also has support for creating applications that are based on WPF, WCF, and WF. It also has templates that are available for working with ASP.NET Ajax and Silverlight, and Visual Studio also has great support for something known as Language Integrated Query for data access. So what are the project templates that Visual Studio provides? Well, the project types allows you to choose what language you want to work with, and under a particular language, a certain category of project. For example, a Visual C# web application, that project type has a number of templates associated with it. And so you can choose ASP.NET Web Application, ASP.NET Ajax Server Control, ASP.NET Server Control, ASP.NET Web Service Application, ASP.NET Ajax Server Control extension, and a WCF Service Application. And you'll notice on this slide that we can, in the upper right corner, that is the list where we can choose which version of the .NET framework we wish to work with, and down towards the bottom of the slide we see where we provide the name for the project, the location of it, and the solution name. Now, in terms of the functionality provided to us by the integrated development environment, we're going to take a look at this more in detail later, but you can see that there's an area that provides a code editor window, and there's also the green button, triangle green button that indicates that you want to test out the application within the debugger. There's also an object browser and a solution explorer window, and for any particular item selected within the editor, there's the properties window, so you can see what properties are associated with that particular item. There's dynamic help, there's a task list window, there's a toolbox, and a server explorer. And we'll take a look at this more detail later. Now, about creating ASP.NET web applications. We're going to take a look at doing this using Visual Studio 2008, and then we're going to talk about the difference between the two main types of creating a website within Visual Studio. So we'll see that there's something known as a website versus something known as a web application. They're actually very similar, but as we will see, there is a slight difference between the two choices. And we'll also take a look at, when we create an ASP.NET web application, we'll take a look at the various files that are created within our website. Now, how do you go about using Visual Studio 2008 in a typical working day? Well, when you first start off with an idea of what you want to create, you design it. And then you get into Visual Studio 2008 and you say File, New Project. You choose the template, it goes and generates some starter code for you. You edit that code, you do your programming work, and when you are ready to try it out, you do a build, and then you go and test it. And if there are problems with it, you go back to debugging it. And within the debugger, you find out how to solve that issue. And you go back and code it a little bit more to fix that problem up. And then you build and test. And so you loop around that until you eventually reach a point where it's thoroughly tested and it's working properly. And then you go ahead and deploy that. Now within Visual Studio, within that oval, all the testing that you do is using the ASP.NET Development Server. When we take that and deploy it, that's where we actually send it out to install it within a virtual folder under the control of IIS. Now I mentioned that we're going to take a look at the difference between something that we refer to as a website versus a web application. So there are actually two different templates that we work with. And so we'll take a look at this in a little bit later in the demonstration within Visual Studio. But just to get an idea of what the difference between these two choices are, note that an ASP.NET web application is similar to the style of project that we used to use in Visual Studio 2003, whereas the ASP.NET website is more similar to the style of web development that we had in Visual Studio 2005. So they made that change from 2003 to 2005, and then in Visual Studio 2008 they decided to provide both styles. One is referred to as a web app, the other one is called a website. Now in terms of the web app, it does involve the project file and a solution file for that application to be created. It also involves a static compilation, so when you do a build it actually does compile it into a set of DLLs. And then it also involves one DLL assembly per web application. In the case of an ASP.NET website, it's folder based, and so when you do a build it doesn't actually compile it into an assembly DLL. Instead, the build is really just for the purpose of verification that you have no syntax errors and that it will be capable of being compiled dynamically upon request at runtime. And so it's folder based, it's not solution file based, and it's a dynamic compile that happens at runtime rather than a static compile. And it actually ends up producing a separate assembly DLL for every page in the website. Now, in terms of the files that are produced for you when you create an ASP.NET website, there are a number of file extensions that you will become familiar with. In terms of web application files, we have web forms or pages, which have the extension ASPX. And associated with those page files are code behind files that end in .cs or .vb depending on the language you choose. So if you have a page called mypage.aspx, the associated code behind file is mypage.aspx.cs if it's a C# application. There is also a global application file which is optional, and that ends in .asax, and that can be useful for defining globally accessible code and data within your website within one file. Other file extensions are ASCX, ASHX, master, resx, skin, dbml, etc. And I won't go into what all of those are now, but there are these file extensions that have specific purposes within a website. Now, in terms of web pages in a website, we've discussed the major file extensions. There is another type of application that you can create using ASP.NET, and that's something known as an XML web service. It has the file extension .asmx, which provides or exposes methods that can be accessed remotely over an internet connection.